The sound came first. Before the sight, before the smell of diesel, before the trembling of the very earth, there was the sound. For a German soldier, 19 years old, huddled in a wet foxhole east of Chartres, in late August of 1944, it was a sound unlike any he had ever known. It was not the sharp crack of rifle fire, nor the guttural roar of a panzer engine, nor even the terrifying whistle of incoming artillery. It was a drone. A low, constant, grinding rumble that started after dusk and did not stop. It was the sound of something immense, something inexhaustible, rolling inexorably forward in the darkness. He would lie there, mud clinging to his worn wool uniform, listening to this river of noise flowing just beyond the horizon. He could not see it, but he could feel it in his bones. It was the sound of a civilization on the move, a sound that told him, more profoundly than any battlefield defeat, that he was not fighting an army. He was fighting an entire industrial world, and it was a world that did not sleep. That sound was the Red Ball Express. It was a name born of American railroad slang, where a red ball marked a package for priority shipment. In the late summer of 1944, it became the name for the most audacious, and perhaps the most decisive, logistical operation of the Second World War. It was an endless convoy of trucks, nearly 6,000 of them, roaring across the scarred landscape of France day and night, 7 days a week. It was a highway of steel and rubber, fueled by gasoline and sheer human will, stretching for hundreds of miles from the Normandy beaches to the hard-charging front lines of General George S. Patton's Third Army, and it was driven, overwhelmingly, by men who were fighting for a nation that did not yet consider them equal. 3/4 of the 23,000 soldiers who formed the backbone of the Red Ball Express were African American. In a segregated army, they had been relegated to service and support roles, deemed by a prejudiced command structure as unfit for combat. Yet, in the 82 days between August 25th and November 16th, 1944, these men would prove that wars are won not only by the pull of a trigger, but by the turning of a wheel. They would shatter the assumptions of the German High Command, who believed such a sustained logistical feat was a physical impossibility. They would deliver over 412,000 tons of supplies, gasoline, ammunition, blood, plasma, rations, boots, and everything in between, powering an advance that some historians believe shortened the war in Europe by as much as 6 months. This is not a story of a single, heroic battle. It is the story of the relentless, grinding effort that made all the other battles possible. It is the story of how an army's greatest weapon was not a tank or a plane, but a simple, rugged, 2.5-ton truck, nicknamed the Jimmy. And it is the story of the forgotten men behind the wheel, who faced down German snipers, Luftwaffe fighters, mechanical failure, and profound exhaustion, all while navigating the deep contradictions of fighting for freedom abroad while being denied it at home. This is the story of how the rumble of endless trucks became the sound of victory. To understand the desperate gamble that was the Red Ball Express, one must first understand the intoxicating, perilous summer of 1944. 7 weeks after the D-Day landings, the Allied armies were still trapped in the Normandy bocage, a dense, claustrophobic landscape of hedgerows that had turned the French countryside into a meat grinder. But on July 25th, that changed. Operation Cobra, a massive American offensive, tore a hole in the German lines west of Saint-Lô. It was the breakout the Allies had prayed for. Through the gap poured the armored divisions of the newly activated U.S. Third Army, under the command of their flamboyant, aggressive, and perpetually controversial leader, General George S. Patton. What followed was a spectacle of speed and violence not seen since the German Blitzkrieg of 1940. Patton's forces didn't just advance, they exploded across France. They raced through towns and villages that had been under Nazi occupation for 4 years, their tank columns cheered by liberated civilians. They bypassed German strongpoints, encircled entire enemy divisions, and chewed up mile after mile of French roadway. In less than a month, the Third Army advanced over 400 miles, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the banks of the Moselle River, on the very doorstep of Germany. It was a breathtaking feat of arms, a validation of American mechanized doctrine. It was also a logistical nightmare. An army, especially a modern mechanized army, is a hungry beast. It devours fuel, ammunition, and food with a voracious, insatiable appetite. A single American armored division, at full tilt, could burn through 750 tons of supplies in a single day. Patton's army was burning through 800,000 gallons of gasoline every 24 hours, and every mile the front line advanced, the supply line, the umbilical cord stretching back to the beaches of Normandy, grew longer and more fragile. The problem was simple and brutal. The Allies had advanced too far, too fast. Their own success was strangling them. The French railway system, a primary target of Allied bombers in the run-up to D-Day, was a mangled wreck, unusable for large-scale transport. The deep-water port of Cherbourg, captured in late June, had been so thoroughly demolished by its German defenders that it was only partially operational. The other major Channel ports, like Antwerp and Le Havre, were still in enemy hands. This meant that nearly every bullet, every can of gasoline, every sea ration had to be landed on the invasion beaches, loaded onto a truck, and then driven hundreds of ever-increasing miles to the front. By late August, 95% of all Allied supplies were still sitting on or near the Normandy beaches, 300 miles behind the forward command posts. The crisis came to a head in the last week of August 1944. Patton's tanks, the spearhead of the Allied advance, began to sputter and halt, their fuel tanks running dry. For a period of 5 agonizing days, the mighty Third Army, which had been poised to plunge into the heart of the Reich, sat idle. Its momentum was gone. The fuel shortage was so acute that on some days, the entire army received less than 10% of its required 400,000 gallons. Patton was incandescent with rage. "I was certainly very full of hopes and saw myself crossing the Rhine," he lamented. But his armored columns were now nothing more than static pillboxes. This pause, born of an empty fuel can, was a gift to the Germans. It gave them precious time to regroup, to rush reinforcements to the front, and to dig in behind the formidable defenses of the Moselle River and the fortress city of Metz. The Supreme Allied Command faced a terrifying prospect. The Great Breakout, the triumphant race across France, was in danger of culminating not in a decisive victory, but in a stalemate reminiscent of the First World War. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, articulated the problem with stark clarity. With 36 divisions in action, we were faced with the problem of delivering from beaches and ports to the front lines some 20,000 tons of supplies every day. The German High Command watched this development with a sense of vindicated superiority. Their own military doctrine was built on the concept of the Kesselschlacht, the battle of encirclement, where an enemy's rapid advance would lead to its logistical self-destruction. They had seen it happen to Napoleon in Russia. They were convinced they were about to see it happen to Patton in France. German military intelligence had long dismissed American logistical capabilities, believing the US Army's reliance on material comfort was a critical weakness. They calculated that supplying an army of that size, over that distance, without rail or ports, was a mathematical impossibility. They were wrong. They had failed to account for a uniquely American answer to the problem. An answer built not on captured railways or deep-water ports, but on the sheer, overwhelming power of the internal combustion engine and an unshakable belief that no problem was unsolvable. The answer was a plan hastily conceived by Army Transportation Corps officers, a desperate, radical, and unprecedented solution. They would create a one-way, non-stop, 4-hour-a-day superhighway dedicated exclusively to supply trucks. They would strip every rear echelon unit of its vehicles, press any soldier who could drive into service, and run them until either the men or the machines broke down. It was named after the railroad symbol for priority freight. On the 25th of August 1944, as Patton's tanks sat silent, the first trucks, their bumpers marked with a stenciled Red Bull, began to roll. The Red Bull Express was born. The machine at the heart of this colossal undertaking was the GMC CCKW, the standard 2.5-ton, six-wheel drive cargo truck of the U.S. Army. To the men who drove it, it was simply the Jimmy or the Deuce and a Half. It was not a sophisticated piece of machinery. It was rugged, powerful, and built to be repaired in the field with basic tools. With its GMC 270 inline-six engine, it could haul 5 tons of cargo, twice its official rating, at a steady 45 miles per hour on a good road. Over 560,000 of them would be produced by General Motors during the war, a staggering number that spoke to the industrial furnace burning back in the United States. It was, as General Eisenhower himself would later reflect, one of the 4 pieces of equipment that were most vital to Allied victory in Europe, alongside the bulldozer, the Jeep, and the C-47 transport plane. General Patton was even more direct, concluding that the two-half truck is our most valuable weapon. The plan itself was a marvel of brutal simplicity. Planners designated 2 parallel highways stretching east from the supply dumps at Saint-Lô. The northern route was for outbound traffic only. The southern route was for the return trip. This created a continuous, closed loop, hundreds of miles long. The roads were declared off-limits to all other traffic, military or civilian. French-language posters were put up, warning civilians to stay clear of the roads reserved for the Red Bull. Military police from the 783rd Battalion were stationed at every crossroads and village square, their sole job to wave the convoys through, ensuring the trucks never had to stop. The rules of the road were strict and unforgiving. Trucks were to travel in convoys, maintaining a speed of 25 miles per hour and a distance of 60 yards between vehicles. Headlights were forbidden at night to avoid attracting the attention of lurking Luftwaffe fighters. Drivers had to navigate the narrow, often damaged French roads using only tiny blackout cat's eye lights, slits of illumination barely visible from a few feet away. Stopping was not permitted, for any reason. If a truck broke down, the driver was instructed to pull it to the side of the road and wait for a roving maintenance crew. The rest of the convoy would thunder past without slowing. This was the theory. The reality, as recalled by the men who lived it, was far more chaotic. The neat convoys often broke apart, with drivers pushing their jimmies as fast as they would go, sometimes exceeding 60 miles per hour, racing alone through the French night to make their delivery time. The 2 5-mile-per-hour speed limit was universally ignored. The round trip, initially from the coast to the supply depots at Chartres, was a grueling 54-hour journey. As the armies advanced, the route stretched further and further, eventually reaching depots near Soissons, Verdun, and the Belgian border, a round trip of nearly 700 miles. The men who drove these routes were not, for the most part, trained truck drivers. The army, in its desperation, had combed its ranks for anyone with a driver's license. They pulled men from artillery units, anti-aircraft batteries, and infantry divisions that were still waiting to be equipped. Most were young, many under the age of 24, and the vast majority, nearly 3 out of every 4, were African American soldiers from segregated quartermaster and transportation corps units. For these men, the Red Bull Express was a profound paradox. The U.S. Army of 1,944 was a reflection of the racially segregated society that created it. A 1925 War College memorandum had codified the belief that black soldiers lacked the intelligence and courage for combat, and they were systematically funneled into service and labor roles. They were commanded by white officers, often from the Jim Crow South. They lived in segregated barracks, ate in segregated mess halls, and faced a pervasive, soul-crushing racism from their own comrades in arms. Many of the men assigned to drive trucks had actually been trained for combat roles, only to find themselves shunted into service companies because of the color of their skin. They were fighting a war for the four freedoms proclaimed by President Roosevelt, while being denied the most basic dignities themselves. They were engaged in a double V campaign: victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. And yet, in this moment of supreme crisis, the Allied war effort depended entirely on them, on their skill, their endurance, their courage. Brigadier General Hewitt G. Plank, the architect of the operation, laid out the stakes in a clear and powerful declaration. Let it never be said that a lack of supplies stopped Patton when the Germans couldn't. The motto of the drivers themselves was simpler, adopted from the French. They heard in the liberated towns, "Tout de suite, right away." A typical run began in the chaos of the supply dumps near Cherbourg or the Normandy beaches. Here, men known as humpers, also predominantly African American, worked around the clock, loading the endless lines of trucks. It was back-breaking labor. A single truck could take 5 tons of ammunition crates, or hundreds of 5-gallon jerry cans of gasoline. The work was slow. It could take up to 40 hours to fully load a convoy of 20 trucks. Once loaded, the driver, often working in a 2-man team to keep the truck moving non-stop, would get his orders and join the river of traffic heading east. The experience of the drive itself was a sensory assault. The roar of the GMC engine was constant, a deafening noise that made conversation impossible. The cab reeked of gasoline, oil, and sweat. The suspension was stiff, and every crater and rut in the war-torn roads sent a jarring shock through the driver's body. Day bled into night, and back into day. The landscape was a blur of wrecked German tanks pushed into ditches, the fresh graves of fallen soldiers, and the faces of French villagers who would stand by the roadside and wave, sometimes offering a piece of fruit or a flower. Corporal James Ruckard, a 19-year-old driver from Ohio, later recalled the terror and the determination of those days. There were dead bodies and dead horses on the highways. After bombs dropped, he said, "I was scared, but I did my job, hoping for the best." Being young and about 4,000 miles away from home, anybody would be scared. They drove through driving rain and thick fog. They navigated narrow village streets where the eaves of medieval buildings seemed to scrape both sides of the truck, and they drove with the constant, gnawing threat of enemy action. The roads were not entirely secure. Pockets of bypassed German soldiers remained, and snipers were a persistent menace. The Luftwaffe, though a shadow of its former self, could still send fighters to strafe the tempting, target-rich convoys. Trucks carrying gasoline and ammunition were explosive packages on wheels. One driver remembered hauling a load of highly volatile incendiary bombs. "If one of them things had gone off," he said, "they wouldn't have found a piece of me or the truck." The danger was real. In one incident, 6 truckers were killed when a German V-2 rocket struck an ammunition dump they were unloading at in northern France. Fatigue was perhaps the greatest enemy of all. Drivers were pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance. They drove for 36, 48, sometimes more than 54 hours with no sleep, save for a few minutes snatched while their partner took the wheel. They chewed Benzedrine tablets to stay awake. They splashed water on their faces, sang, shouted, did anything to fight off the crushing weight of exhaustion. Inevitably, accidents happened. Trucks would veer off the road, overturn, or collide with one another in the dark. The roadsides of the Red Bull route were littered with the mechanical carcasses of these accidents. Still, the river flowed on. The motto of the Transportation Corps was, "Nothing happens until something moves," and these men embodied it. As one article in the Stars and Stripes newspaper reported, truck drivers have worked 20 hours a day, and when their trucks zigzagged, they stopped, splashed water on their faces and drove on. They got the supplies to the front, and if necessary, they died with their hands on their wheels. For the German soldier in his foxhole, the sound was a source of dread and bewilderment. For the German High Command, it was a source of disbelief. The Wehrmacht, for all its vaunted reputation as a mechanized force, was in fact heavily reliant on horse-drawn transport. A typical German infantry division in 1944 had nearly 10 times as many horses as it did motor vehicles. While American quartermasters worried about gasoline, their German counterparts worried about oats and fodder. The German Blitzkrieg had always been a logistical gamble, a short, sharp spear thrust that depended on winning quickly before its fragile supply lines collapsed. The concept of a sustained, high-volume, long-distance supply operation like the Red Ball Express was simply alien to their way of thinking and beyond their industrial capacity. Captured German officers, upon interrogation, expressed astonishment and a grudging admiration. They had based their entire defensive strategy in France on the assumption that the Allies would be forced into a long, operational pause after the breakout, hamstrung by their own logistical limitations. They believed Patton's advance would inevitably run out of steam, just as Rommel's had in North Africa, but the rumble never stopped. Major General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the elite Panzer Division, wrote a bitter letter to his wife that was later captured. "We are not fighting soldiers anymore," he observed, "but an industrial process. They don't defeat us in battle, they overwhelm us with trucks." This psychological impact was as significant as the material deliveries. The endless columns of American trucks became a form of warfare in themselves. They were a rolling, rumbling testament to an industrial power that the Third Reich could not hope to match. The German soldier might fight with courage and skill, but he was fighting an enemy that seemed to have an infinite supply of everything. While a German unit was rationing its last few rounds of ammunition, they could hear the sound of the American army being resupplied for the next 100 battles. It was a sound that broke morale. General Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff, offered a concise and devastating post-war assessment. "We Germans asked, how can we win this battle? Americans asked, how can we supply this army? We focused on the operation. They focused on the process. History records who chose correctly." The sheer numbers were, and remain, staggering. On its peak day, the 29th of August, 1944, a fleet of 5,958 Red Bull trucks delivered a record 12,342 tons of supplies. At any given moment, day or night, an average of 900 vehicles were on the road, bumper to bumper. The operation itself consumed a colossal 300,000 gallons of fuel each day, nearly as much as an entire field army. It was a calculated risk, a gamble that the war would be won before the trucks and the men simply wore out. And they did wear out. The mechanical attrition rate was astronomical. The GMC Jimmies were durable, but they were not indestructible. Pushed far beyond their intended limits, driven over broken roads for 24 hours a day, they broke down in droves. At one point, the daily vehicle failure rate was as high as 30%. Tires shredded, engines seized, transmissions failed. Keeping the fleet moving was a logistics miracle in its own right, performed by unsung mechanics who worked in makeshift depots along the route. Men like Technical Sergeant Emmanuel Wilson Green of the 3989th Motor Transport Company, a mechanic from Virginia, became masters of improvisation, cannibalizing wrecked trucks for parts, performing engine overhauls in muddy fields, and somehow getting broken-down vehicles back on the road. At one point in September, maintenance fell so far behind that 27 entire truck companies went without any servicing for several days. A catastrophic breach of protocol that somehow did not stop the flow of supplies. It wasn't just the mechanics who performed miracles. It was the drivers themselves who often blurred the line between service and combat. One tank driver in the 5th Armored Division recalled his desperation and gratitude. "If it wasn't for the Red Bull, we couldn't have moved. They all were black drivers and they delivered in the heat of combat. We'd be in our tanks praying for them to come up." An Armored Division commander was quoted in Stars and Stripes giving a blunt, heartfelt tribute. "We often refuel and rearm even while fighting," he said. "That takes guts. Our Negro outfits delivered gas under constant fire. Damned if I'd want their job. They have what it takes. This recognition from the frontline combat troops was vital, a small but significant acknowledgement of shared sacrifice in an army that was otherwise deeply divided by race. For the black drivers of the Red Ball Express, this was the crucible in which their identity as soldiers was forged. They were not merely truck drivers, they were lifelines. They were proving, under the most arduous conditions imaginable, the racist doctrines of their own military command to be a contemptible lie. They were demonstrating not just competence, but extraordinary courage and resilience, and in doing so, they were staking a claim to full citizenship, a claim that would echo long after the guns fell silent. Consider, for a moment, a simple, ubiquitous object from that time, a can of sea rations. To the American G.I., it was a mundane, often reviled necessity. It was processed meat, hard biscuits, and a packet of instant coffee. But that same can, seen through other eyes, became a symbol of something far greater. To a French child in a newly liberated village, handed a can of rations from the window of a passing Jimmy, it was a taste of impossible luxury. To a captured German soldier, observing the casual abundance with which Americans consumed and even discarded these items, it was a demoralizing sign of an enemy with limitless resources. One captured German document revealed the utter bewilderment of Wehrmacht officers. They had learned that the Americans were operating field bakeries just a few miles behind the front lines, providing fresh bread to combat troops. To a German army that considered hardtack a staple, this was an absurdity. It seemed to confirm their propaganda about the softness and decadence of American soldiers. But what they slowly, painfully came to realize was that this wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the ultimate expression of strength. An army that could bake bread and deliver ice cream in a war zone possessed an industrial and logistical power that was beyond their comprehension. Every can of sea rations, every pack of cigarettes, every 5-gallon jerry can of gasoline delivered by a Red Bull truck was a nail in the coffin of the Third Reich. The Red Ball Express was not just delivering supplies, it was delivering the crushing, undeniable reality of American industrial civilization to the battlefields of Europe. It was proving that modern warfare was a contest of factories and supply chains as much as it was a contest of tactics and courage. The Red Ball Express was always intended to be a temporary, emergency measure. By mid-September, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Belgium and toward the German border, the supply lines had been stretched to their breaking point. The autumn rains began, turning the roads into quagmires and slowing the advance to a crawl. The great race across France was over, and a new, brutal war of attrition was beginning in the forests of the Ardennes and the fortified Siegfried Line. The logistical equation was changing. On November 1st, 1944, the port of Antwerp was finally open to Allied shipping, providing a deep-water harbour far closer to the front lines. The desperate need for the long-haul truck convoys from Normandy began to diminish. On the 16th of November 1944, after 82 consecutive days of non-stop operation, the Red Ball Express was officially shut down. Its mission was complete. In that short span, it had delivered 412,193 tons of supplies, driving a staggering 122 million ton miles. It had kept Patton's army and the entire Allied offensive alive at the most critical juncture of the campaign. The cost had been immense. The fleet of nearly 6,000 trucks was, for all intents and purposes, destroyed. They were worn out, broken down, and driven into the ground. The men were even more so. They were hollow-eyed with fatigue, their bodies racked by the endless vibration and strain, their minds scarred by the constant danger and the sheer, grinding monotony of the work. What awaited them was not a hero's welcome. There were no parades for the drivers of the Red Ball Express. Having performed one of the most vital tasks of the European war, the African-American soldiers who formed its majority returned to the reality of a segregated army. They went back to their segregated barracks, their menial support duties, and the pervasive racism that had defined their service. Their monumental achievement was largely overlooked. a footnote in the grand histories of the war that focused on generals and glorious battles. The promise of the Double V remained unfulfilled, yet something had changed. The story of the Red Ball Express is more than a tale of military logistics. It is a chapter in the long and arduous story of the American civil rights movement. The soldiers who drove those trucks had not only witnessed the liberation of France, they had experienced a profound liberation of their own. They had seen a world without Jim Crow laws. They had been greeted as heroes by white Europeans who saw them not as black men, but as American liberators, and they had proven, to themselves and to anyone willing to see, that they were the equal of any soldier in any army. They had done the impossible. They returned home with a new sense of their own worth, a new confidence, and a new determination to fight for the freedoms at home that they had secured abroad. The generation of black veterans who returned from World War II would become the foot soldiers and leaders of the civil rights movement that would transform America in the decades to come. The legacy of the Red Ball Express is threefold. First, it stands as a monument to the raw power of American industry and logistical genius. It forced a fundamental shift in the understanding of modern warfare, proving that logistical capability is not something that merely supports military power, it is military power. It demonstrated that in a conflict between industrial giants, victory belongs to the side that can best mobilize its entire economic and organizational might. The Germans had the better tank, in the Tiger, and perhaps the better machine gun, in the MG-42. But the Americans had the better truck, and they had 500,000 of them. In the end, that made all the difference. Second, it is a testament to the unheralded and often forgotten contributions of African American soldiers to the victory in World War II. It is a story that directly refutes the racist caricatures that were official U.S. Army policy at the time. The courage, resilience, and unwavering dedication of these men were not peripheral to the Allied success. They were absolutely central to it. Without the Red Ball Express, the advance across France would have stalled, the war would have been prolonged, and countless more lives would have been lost. Colonel John D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander's son, stated it unequivocally. Without the Red Ball truck drivers, the advance across France could not have been made. Finally, and perhaps most profoundly, the story of the Red Ball Express is a story about a sound, the low, unceasing rumble of thousands of engines, a sound that haunted the dreams of German soldiers and gave hope to the armies of liberation. It was the sound of a promise being kept, the sound of a nation's full power being brought to bear. It was a mechanical symphony of victory, performed by men who were denied the full meaning of the word. They drove through the darkness, their faces illuminated only by the faint glow of the dashboard, carrying the fuel and the bullets that would win the war. They were ordinary men, asked to do an extraordinary thing, and in doing so, they not only saved an army, they helped to change a nation. The echoes of their engines can still be heard, a reminder that the road to victory is paved not just with courage, but with the relentless, unglamorous, and absolutely essential work of keeping things moving.